My name is Celeste Rowen. I'm 42 years old. I served 23 years in the U.S. Army, most of them overseas. I've worn body armor heavier than my brother's conscience. I've held the hands of soldiers bleeding out in the dirt, while mortars screamed overhead. I've written final letters for men who never got to say goodbye. But none of that prepared me for the moment my own family tried to erase me in open court, no less. It was the fourth day of the hearing. I was sitting still in my navy blue suit, hands folded in my lap. No ribbons, no medals, just the plain version of me. Across the courtroom, my brother Wyatt leaned in to whisper something to his lawyer, then stood up like he owned the damn floor. His voice was too loud when he said it. "She's a fraud. She never served. She made it all up to steal our father's house." I heard gasps before the judge could speak. My mother flinched, whether from shock or shame, I didn't care. For a moment, it felt like the entire room had turned on its axis. Like gravity had shifted, and I was the only one still sitting upright. But I didn't argue. I didn't shout. Instead, I reached into the leather briefcase beside me and pulled out a worn tan folder. It was thinner than you'd expect for something that could change the course of 3 lives. I stood and walked slowly to the judge's bench. The room went so quiet you could hear the flick of a paper corner as I set the folder down in front of him. He opened it. Then everything changed. His eyes narrowed. His voice dropped to a whisper. "No one move." Bailiff closed the doors. That's when the military police walked in. 2 of them, quiet boots, unreadable faces. And that's when my brother realized I didn't come here to win a fight. I came here to end the war. The house sat on a bluff overlooking the Pacific just north of Mendocino. It wasn't big, not by coastal California standards, and the white paint had peeled back in places where the salt air clung too long. But it had stood for generations, long enough to hold more memory than drywall. To me, it had always felt like the last thing in the world that didn't lie. I came back to it 2 weeks after my father's funeral. The air still smelled like sage and ocean fog, and the front gate creaked the same way it did when I was 8 and trying to sneak out to the beach before breakfast. Nothing had changed except everything had. Dad was gone. Wyatt was already talking about commercial development potential. And Mom? Well, Mom hadn't looked me in the eye since the will was read. It was a small service, closed casket. No military honors despite Dad's 4 years in the Navy. Wyatt said something about keeping it simple. I kept my mouth shut. The funeral wasn't the place to fight, even when I felt the tension like barbed wire under my skin. I stood beside my younger brother Evan during the service. He looked down the whole time, hands jammed in his coat pockets, like he was bracing for a storm. Maybe he was. Dad left the house to me. That much was clear. No conditions, no shared ownership. Just a clean clause in the will. To Celeste, the house at Windbluff for her use and care. Wyatt inherited the adventure tour business, the same company Dad built from the ground up after getting out of the Navy. Evan got a trust fund. It should have been straightforward. It wasn't. I moved into the house alone. No boxes, just a duffel bag, and the medals I never hung up. I spent the first week airing out rooms, scrubbing windows, weeding the old herb beds my dad used to tend every Sunday before the VA visits made him too tired to stand. I didn't expect anyone to show up, and no one did. Not until the envelope came. It was hand-delivered, heavy paper, cream-colored. I set it on the kitchen table and stared at it for nearly an hour before opening it. I don't know why, maybe because deep down I already knew what was inside. Summons. Filed by Wyatt and co-signed by our mother. They were suing me for the house. Their claim, fraud. They said I'd faked my military service. That I'd manipulated our father into leaving me the property. That I'd stolen valor and, worse, used that lie to secure federal benefits I didn't deserve. I remember reading that sentence 3 times. Fraud. They called me a fraud. I didn't cry, I didn't rage. I just stared at the line until the ink blurred. Then I made myself a black coffee, walked out to the back porch, and sat in Dad's old wicker chair. The same one he used to fall asleep in while reading the Mercury News. I waited until the sun dipped below the waterline before I finally said it out loud. So that's how it is. The next morning, I drove down the coast to the Veterans Records Office. By noon, I had requested certified copies of my DD-214 commendation letters, injury reports, even the field reports from Ghazni province, where I took shrapnel to the shoulder. I didn't just want to defend myself. I wanted to annihilate the lie. Still something gnawed at me. Why now Dad had been gone barely a month? The house wasn't worth millions. It needed repairs. The plumbing was ancient. The deck sagged. Wyatt made more in a month from the family business than the place was worth in a year. So why fight for it because it mattered? Not the money, the meaning. This house was history. It was the one place I ever felt like I belonged. The one place that didn't care whether I was the odd one, the quiet one, the daughter who didn't go to business school or marry a real estate developer. I was the one who left for war and never really came back. And Wyatt. He was the golden boy who never left. The one who knew how to charm a room and talk profit margins at the breakfast table. He always resented that Dad left the company to him, but the soul of the family to me. I think he wanted to wipe that last part clean. Evan didn't say a word. Not when I called him, not when I asked if he knew. He just said I can't talk about it and hung up. That silence hurt worse than the lawsuit. I sat up late that night at the kitchen table, going through old boxes, letters, field journals, and photos. At some point, I stopped trying to understand why they were doing it and started preparing for what I knew was coming. This wasn't about a house. This was about erasing me, so I sharpened my knives metaphorically. I called a lawyer. I hired a forensic records specialist. I combed through every file I'd kept since basic training. I made copies, backups, then backups of those. And I waited. Because something in me knew if they were willing to lie this boldly, they'd planned it for months, maybe years. And I was done being quiet. I didn't leave home in anger. I left because staying would have broken something in me. I wasn't sure I could rebuild. I was 18 the day I walked out the front door of the Windbluff house, with nothing but a government-issued duffel bag and a letter of acceptance from the Army. The morning air was sharp with salt and eucalyptus, and the sun hadn't yet touched the water. My father stood by the porch railing. Arms crossed, his navy cap tucked under one arm like it still meant something. "Don't let them make you small, Celeste," he told me. "Whatever happens, you walk tall." He didn't hug me, he didn't cry, he just nodded, the kind of nod that carried more weight than words ever could. Wyatt didn't come out to say goodbye. Mom stayed inside, stirring her coffee like it owed her answers. Evan hovered in the doorway, pale and hesitant, but he didn't cross the threshold. That was the Rowen family way: draw lines, then pretend they were fences and not walls. Basic training stripped me of everything I thought I was. Then it rebuilt me with iron and order and the sharp edges of responsibility. I learned how to fire a rifle, how to stay awake for 72 hours, how to carry another human being up a hill while taking fire. But more than that, I learned how silence could be strength, and how surviving meant knowing when to speak and when to wait. Deployment followed deployment. Iraq, then Afghanistan, then back again. I stopped counting countries when the tally started to feel like scars. I rose through the ranks fast, not because I was brilliant, but because I was dependable. Because I didn't flinch when chaos erupted. I didn't blink when someone needed a leader, even if the sky was falling. The people under my command didn't care what my family thought of me. They cared that I had their backs. And I did. Every damn time. One night outside of Kandahar, an IED tore through our convoy. Shrapnel ripped into my shoulder, severing nerves, fracturing bone. I didn't lose consciousness, but part of me didn't come back from that desert. They pulled me out, got me patched up, sent me back in. Because that's what you do. You go back in, even when everything hurts. After 23 years of service, I retired with full honors. There was a small ceremony at Fort Lewis, folded flag commendation, a few speeches. My CO asked if my family would be attending. I said no. He didn't press. I hadn't heard from them in years by that point. A birthday card from Evan once. A Christmas email from Mom that forgot to include my name. Wyatt didn't bother pretending, so I didn't tell them I was coming home. I rented a car and drove down the coast alone, stopping only when I hit Mendocino. The roads felt familiar but strange, like a song you haven't heard since childhood. When I pulled up to the old house on the cliff, I half expected someone to meet me at the door. No one did. The key was still hidden under the rusted fish-shaped rock Dad had always used. The lock stuck the way it used to. The air inside smelled like dust and time. I didn't expect a welcome. But I also didn't expect the cold silence that greeted me when Wyatt showed up 2 days later unannounced with his sleeves rolled up and sunglasses perched like a badge of authority. "This place needs to be sold," he said, stepping into the kitchen without waiting for permission. "It's a liability, sell your taxes alone." "It's mine," I said, not looking up from the kettle I was filling. His mouth twitched. Dad wasn't in his right mind when he wrote that will. I turned to face him then. "Don't," he stared at me like he was seeing a ghost. "You really think you can just drop back in here after vanishing for decades?" And what play the dutiful daughter now, I didn't answer. He didn't stay long. When he left, he said something under his breath. Low enough I could pretend I didn't hear. "She's not even a real vet." I told myself it didn't matter. I'd been hardened by worse. I'd survived worse. But that lie, that particular knife, cut deep. For weeks I tried to live quietly. I cleaned out Dad's workshop. I started a routine. Morning walks, grocery runs, even tried a book club at the library, though I only lasted 2 sessions before realizing I didn't know how to make small talk anymore. The house creaked at night. Sometimes I thought I heard Dad's footsteps upstairs, even though I knew better. Sometimes I wished I didn't. Then came the envelope, the lawsuit, the accusation, and everything I'd spent 2 decades building, the life, the service, the silence, collapsed under the weight of 2 signatures. My brother's and my mother's. I was back home. But they had never stopped trying to exile me. There's a strange clarity that comes with war. You learn very quickly what matters and what doesn't. Whether it's a photograph tucked inside your flak vest, or the rhythm of your squad's breathing before a breach, the truth of who you are gets stripped bare. And for me, that truth was simple: in combat, I mattered. In uniform, I was seen. But at home, I was just a burden people wanted to forget. I didn't realize how deep that fracture ran until I came back for good. The day after the lawsuit arrived, I walked through every room in the Windbluff house. Not cleaning, not organizing, just walking, remembering. The sun still flooded the east windows around 8 in the morning. The hall still carried the scent of cedar from Dad's old coat. The guest room still had the chipped paint from when Evan, barely 10, tried to redecorate without permission. And in the upstairs bathroom mirror, I could still see a faint etching of the letters CR carved behind the towel rack. My initials. But the woman staring back at me in the glass, she wasn't the kid who carved them. She wasn't even the soldier who had stood at attention during 4 separate flag ceremonies for friends who never came home. She was harder, quieter, and more alone than she wanted to admit. Wyatt didn't just want the house. He wanted the narrative. He needed to be the responsible son, the one left behind to run the business and take care of Mom. My presence ruined that symmetry. Because no matter how far I'd gone or how long I'd stayed away, I was still my father's daughter. The one he trusted with the only thing he couldn't rebuild once he was gone. Wyatt didn't want to share a legacy. He wanted to rewrite it. And Mom, she let him. When I called her after the court summons arrived, she answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice was calm, clipped. "Celeste. Mom, did you really sign this?" A pause. "Long enough to say everything." "I did." "Why?" Another pause. "Then your brother has concerns. He's worried about the legitimacy of the will. My service records are real. You know that." I don't know what to believe anymore. That was the last thing she said before hanging up. Not goodbye. Not even a damn sigh. Just silence. The kind that burns hotter than any scream ever could. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that call, staring at the grain in the wood. I remembered being 10, sitting in that very chair while Dad taught me how to draw a compass rose. He'd said, "Even when you're lost, this'll show you where you're standing." Now I was back in the same spot, and I didn't know where the hell I stood anymore. The next week blurred. Lawyers, phone calls, document requests. My attorney, a former Navy JAG officer named Camila Vargas, listened more than she spoke. She read everything: my DD 214, my medical reports, deployment photos, commendation letters. When she finally looked up from the stack, her eyes didn't blink. "They're going to try to bury you in noise," she said. "You need to be louder, in fact." I nodded. "I've been quiet my whole life. That ends now. But I didn't go public. Not yet. I didn't post anything. Didn't call in favors. I didn't even correct the cashier at the grocery store when she paused mid-sentence and said, 'You look like someone I saw on the news.' I just gathered every document, every field photo, every surgery report, every pay stub. I built a folder so thick it could anchor a boat. And then I built a second one, thin, sharp, precise, just in case. I also started keeping a journal again. Not because I thought anyone would read it, but because my mind had started to drift in strange ways. Flashbacks, dreams, fragments. I'd stand at the sink doing dishes and suddenly be back in Helmand Province shouting orders through a storm of dust and gunfire. Or I'd be sitting on the porch and the wind would carry a scent that reminded me of engine oil, dried blood, and sand. I didn't feel broken. I felt disassembled, like I'd been put back together wrong. But nothing triggered me more than the sight of Wyatt's name on those legal papers. My own brother, the one who used to steal my Halloween candy but leave behind the peanut butter cups because he knew they were my favorite. The one who used to lie to mom and dad when I snuck in after curfew. The one who years later couldn't even look me in the eye when I came home with a silver star pinned to my uniform. Because he'd already decided I didn't fit anymore. Because I didn't help the story he wanted to tell. That night I poured myself a whiskey neat, just the way Dad drank it, and stepped out onto the back porch. The sea was restless, churning, the same way it always was when a storm was building out of sight. I stared into the dark and made myself a promise. If they wanted a fight, I'd give them one. But I wouldn't fight like them. I'd fight like the soldier they refused to believe I was. Because war had made me whole, but coming home had made me hollow. The lawsuit wasn't just a betrayal. It was a declaration of war, and they made the first move on paper. The official language was tidy, sterile. Petition for judicial review of the estate of Franklin Rowen. Request to challenge beneficiary designation. Allegations of misrepresentation in federal service documentation. But beneath all that legal jargon was something far uglier. They were calling me a liar, a thief, a fraud who had manipulated a dying man into handing over his legacy. It hit like a slow-motion grenade. I sat at the kitchen table, same chair, same sunlight slanting through the dusty glass, and read the packet 3 times. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. But by the third read, my hands had gone still flat on the wood, like I was bracing for impact. I had survived mortar shells and convoy ambushes, but nothing in the military taught me how to take a hit like this from people who once called me daughter and sister. I kept flipping through the pages trying to find the part that made sense. But none of it did. According to them, I had never served. Not really. They claimed my paperwork was inconsistent, that my awards were unverified, that my injury nerve damage from an IED blast near Kandahar was non-combat related. There was even a statement from Wyatt's attorney, implying that I had psychological motivations for inserting herself into the family legacy. Psychological motivations, as if wanting to hold on to the one place in this world that hadn't abandoned me, made me delusional. I stared at the bottom of the packet where both Wyatt and my mother had signed their names. Her signature was neat, familiar, almost gentle. It was the same handwriting she used on birthday cards and grocery lists. Seeing it there aligned with an accusation that cut through my identity made something inside me split. I called Evan again that night. He picked up after 6 rings. I could hear traffic in the background, the buzz of his turn signal clicking. "You saw it?" I asked. Silence. Evan. His voice was low, tired. "I did. And I didn't know they were going to do this. That's not the same as not agreeing with it." More silence. "Then I don't know what you want me to say." I wanted him to say it was wrong. That he believed me. That he'd stand by me like I stood by him when we were kids, and he used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. I wanted him to say he remembered that I held his hand at Dad's funeral, because he couldn't stop shaking. But he didn't say any of that. "I have to go," he said. And just like that, he was gone. The betrayal wasn't just what they filed in court. It was the echo of silence from the only brother who had ever looked at me without judgment. The next day I met with Camila again. She was sitting in her office surrounded by paper transcripts, military verification forms, digital timestamps. She looked up when I entered, no small talk. "I need you to understand," she said, "this isn't just about proving you served. It's about proving motive. They're painting you as someone who targeted your father's will for personal gain. They're going to turn your service into a narrative of manipulation." "Let them try," I said. She nodded, but her jaw was tight. "We'll need more than documentation. We need intent on their part. Something to show this isn't a good faith misunderstanding. Something to show they planned this. I didn't have that. Yet. But I had my instincts, and they were screaming that this wasn't spontaneous. This had been in motion long before Dad passed, maybe even while he was alive. For weeks I operated like a soldier again. Early mornings, strategic meetings, I compiled timelines, created cross-references. I requested deployment logs from Fort Lewis, personal letters from my commanding officers, scanned photos with timestamp metadata. I even tracked down an old medic who had pulled shrapnel from my shoulder. He agreed to testify. But the deeper I dug, the more I felt like something was missing, like there was a thread I hadn't pulled yet. One that would unravel the whole damn thing if I could just find where it began. Wyatt stayed quiet publicly. He knew better than to stir the press. But he was feeding whispers through legal channels, and I could feel the tide shifting. People in town began looking at me differently, like they weren't sure what to believe. The barista at the cafe stopped calling me by name. The librarian hesitated before handing me the latest title I requested, asking, "You're Celeste Rowen, right?" Each interaction was a paper cut, small but bleeding just the same. Then came the real blow. My mother appeared in a televised interview with a local news station. She looked elegant, polished in that cool New England way she'd perfected over decades. The interviewer asked her gently, "Do you believe your daughter lied about her service?" She didn't flinch. "I believe my daughter has been through difficult things, but I also believe that grief can make people do confusing, even harmful things. We just want the truth." The implication was clear. Celeste is unstable. Celeste is grieving. Celeste can't be trusted. And she said it with the same mouth that once kissed my scraped knees and told me bedtime stories about strong girls who saved the day. That night I didn't sleep. I sat on the back steps of the house, knees tucked to my chest, listening to the wind slice through the pine trees. I didn't feel brave. I didn't feel strong. But I knew one thing with cold, crystalline certainty. They weren't looking for the truth. They were looking for a story where I didn't exist, and I was about to burn that story down. I stopped expecting backup. There was a point early on when I still believed someone might step in, an old friend, a neighbor, even Evan if he could find the spine. But as the days dragged on and the hearing crept closer, it became painfully clear I would be going into this war alone. I was used to isolation. You don't spend 2 decades in combat zones without learning how to live in your own head. But this was different. This wasn't about survival. This was about being erased. Every time I opened my laptop, there was another email from Camila with more lies to disprove. Every time I picked up the phone, it was another request for evidence, for context, for clarification. I began to feel like I was scraping together the pieces of my own existence, pulling every photograph, certificate, sworn statement, and timeline. Like I was building a case not just against them, but against the slow creeping doubt gnawing at the corners of my mind. Because that's what their strategy was. Not just to discredit me in the eyes of the court, but to make me question my own truth. I couldn't shake the memory of my mother's calm voice on the news saying I'd been through difficult things. She said it like I was fragile, like I was unstable. As if 23 years of leadership, of holding the line in the ugliest corners of the world, had left me too cracked to trust. But I wasn't broken. I was just tired. And God help anyone who mistook my exhaustion for surrender. I set up my war room in the dining room. The long oak table was covered in files and manila folders, post-its, and highlighters, USB drives, and court calendars. I used my father's old leather briefcase to organize the hard copies, the same one he carried every day for 30 years, until his hands began to tremble too much to zip it closed. I didn't cry over that detail. I just added it to the list. One morning, while reviewing a notarized statement from my former commanding officer, I noticed something odd. In the evidence packet submitted by Wyatt's attorney, there was a falsified version of the exact same letter, but it had a different date and a slightly different phrasing. My name had been misspelled, subtle, almost clever, but the watermark was wrong. The signature, forged. I stared at the 2 documents side by side for 10 full minutes. Then I called Camilla. "They're forging records," I said. "Are you certain they didn't even spell my name right?" Silence. "I'll get our forensic guy on it," she said, "and we'll notify the judge's clerk. But Celeste, this changes things. Good. It also means they're getting desperate. Then they're not the only ones." She didn't ask what I meant. She didn't need to. By week's end, Camilla had submitted a motion to have the evidence independently verified. The judge approved. But the hearing was still weeks away, and the machine on their side didn't stop. Blog posts began popping up with headlines like "Hero" or "Hoax." The Celeste Rowen story. Anonymous users on local forums posted screenshots of deployment logs that had been doctored to suggest I'd spent more time stateside than abroad. A fake LinkedIn profile appeared claiming to be Celeste Rowen, Valor imposter. And people believed it. Not everyone, but enough. The barista at the coffee shop started making my drink wrong. The woman at the hardware store asked for ID before letting me buy paint thinner. It wasn't overt hostility. It was worse than that. It was suspicion. It was the look people give you when they think they've almost figured out what you're hiding. I stopped going out unless I had to. I kept the curtains drawn. I slept with the hallway light on, even though I hadn't done that since Afghanistan. There it was to keep the rats away. Here it was to keep the ghosts out, the ones that wore my family's faces. And still nothing from Evan. Not a call, not a text, not a knock on the door. I wanted to hate him for that. I really did. But the truth is, I understood. Because Evan was the kind of person who folded before the fight even started. He had spent a lifetime making himself smaller to survive Wyatt's shadow and our mother's cold conditional love. He wasn't cruel, just afraid. Still, his silence stung more than Wyatt's aggression. Wyatt wanted to destroy me. Evan just couldn't decide if I was worth saving. That distinction kept me up more nights than I cared to admit. I started running again. Just before dawn, when the sky was pale and empty, I'd lace up my boots and take the cliffside trail behind the house. I wasn't training. I wasn't trying to outrun anything. I just needed to remember what it felt like to move under my own power, to control something, even if it was just my breath, one foot in front of the other, steady through the mist. Sometimes when I reached the highest point of the ridge, I'd stop and look down at the house. It looked so small from there, tucked between the trees and the sea. Like something fragile, temporary. A place that could vanish with the next high tide. But it hadn't. It was still standing. And so was I. It was a Tuesday when Evan finally showed up. I remember because I had just finished my morning run and was standing barefoot in the kitchen, sweating through an old army t-shirt, while the kettle whistled. The knock on the front door wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, 3 short taps, like he didn't want to startle me. Or maybe like he hoped I wouldn't answer. I opened the door, and there he was, standing on the porch with his hands jammed in the pockets of his fleece jacket, shoulders hunched like he was bracing for wind that never came. "Hey," he said. Just that. "Hey." I stepped aside without a word. He walked in like he hadn't been gone, like he hadn't left me to fight alone for the past 6 weeks, while our mother accused me of lying, and Wyatt tried to erase me from legal existence. He didn't sit right away, just stood there in the middle of the living room, looking around like the house was something sacred and dangerous at the same time. "You cleaned the fireplace," he murmured. I folded my arms. "What do you want, Evan?" He flinched a little at the tone, but he didn't leave. That I'll give him credit for. "I came to talk," he said. I waited. I didn't know about the lawsuit, not at first. "You found out eventually, still didn't call." He looked down. I didn't know what to say. That's never stopped Wyatt. His mouth tightened into something like shame. He turned and walked to the window, looking out at the sea like it might give him better words than I would. The silence stretched. Not tense, just tired. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a flash drive. Small, black, scuffed like it had been sitting in the bottom of a drawer for too long. "I found this on Mom's laptop," he said quietly. "Months ago, before Dad died." I didn't reach for it. "What is it?" "Emails. Between her and Wyatt. Stuff about changing the will. About how to discredit you if you pushed back. Financial records, 2 transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. And fake documents. Drafts of press statements. They planned it, Celeste. All of it." He held out the flash drive, still not looking at me. I should have said something sooner. I know that. I took it without a word. For a second, all I could hear was the wind outside and the faint hum of the kettle still sitting on the stove. Then I walked to the kitchen, turned off the burner, and leaned against the counter. "Why now?" I asked. He swallowed. His voice was lower than before. "Because you're the only one who ever stood up for me. That stopped me. When we were kids," he continued, "you covered for me when I skipped practice. When I couldn't sleep, you let me crawl into your bed even though Mom told you not to. And I watched you leave. I watched you go off to war because this house couldn't hold you. And now you're back and they're trying to crush you for it." He turned to face me fully for the first time. I didn't know how to fight them. I still don't. But I know what they're doing is wrong. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then I nodded just once. "Okay," that was all I said. Not "thank you." Not "I forgive you," not yet. Some wounds don't scab over in a single afternoon. We sat on the porch for the next hour without saying much. He nursed a cup of black coffee, too hot for how fast he drank it. I kept the flash drive in my pocket fingers, wrapped around it like it might disappear if I let go. He told me he was still talking to Mom, that she refused to believe any of it, that Wyatt convinced her I was mentally unwell, that the military had changed me. "She says you're paranoid," Evan said softly, "that you're out for revenge." I looked at him then. "I don't want revenge." He nodded. "I know. I want the truth." Another nod. "And I want it to hurt. Not physically, not with blood. I want it to undo everything they built on a lie." For once, he didn't shy away from that. He didn't recoil. He just sat with it, shoulders slumped, eyes trained on the horizon. Like he was finally ready to see something other than the inside of his own guilt. When he left, he didn't ask for forgiveness, and I didn't offer it. But something had shifted. The little boy I once protected had finally shown up. Not perfectly, not with strength, but with truth. And in a family like ours, truth was rebellion. That night, I plugged in the flash drive and opened the files. What I saw made my stomach twist. Bank transfers from a veterans charity linked to Wyatt. Communications about press leaks. Digital timestamps that aligned too perfectly with the date on the forged service letter submitted in court. They hadn't just tried to win the case. They'd tried to manufacture reality. And now I had the receipts. I spent hours organizing the data, creating backups, timestamping everything again with a chain of custody report. When I finally shut the laptop, the house was dark and silent around me. I sat in the quiet for a long time, staring at my father's old chair in the corner. Then I said it out loud. "They think I came back to claim the house." I shook my head. "They don't know I came back to finish what he started. War doesn't begin when the first shot is fired. It begins when someone decides they'll do anything to win." For Wyatt, that moment came when he started forging documents before our father's body was even cold. For me, it came the night I cataloged every file on that flash drive and realized the extent of the deception I was up against. They hadn't just questioned my service. They had weaponized it. The next morning, I drove to Camila's office before the sun had fully risen. I didn't call ahead. I just walked in, dropped the flash drive on her desk, and said, "We're done playing defense." She looked at it, then at me, her expression unreadable. "Where did you get this, Evan? Will he testify? I don't know, but the data stands regardless." She nodded slowly, already plugging the drive into her secure laptop. As the folders opened, her brows furrowed. Lines of emails, PDFs, fake legal memos, all neatly labeled and dated. Her eyes flicked up to me. "You realize this changes everything." "Good," I said, "because everything needs to change." That afternoon, Camilla brought in a forensic analyst, a calm gray-haired man named Ritter, who used to work intelligence for the Department of Defense. He didn't say much, just nodded, took notes, and started verifying the files. Chain of custody, metadata, IP traces, dates, and file versions. Every time he gave a quiet grunt, I knew we were getting closer to the crack in their foundation. Meanwhile, I built a second front. I reached out to people from my past, people who could speak to the truth of my service. Former soldiers I'd commanded, medics who had patched me up in the field, COs who had signed off on every deployment. Some hadn't heard from me in years, but once they knew what was happening, they didn't hesitate. One sent me a signed statement recounting the night in Kandahar, when I refused to evacuate until every soldier in my convoy was accounted for, even while bleeding from my own wound. Another wrote a letter describing how I volunteered to mentor young female recruits in forward operating bases, where few dared step out without armor. I collected them all, printed them, labeled and time-stamped every page. Facts. Not tears, not anger, just facts. Cold. Undeniable. I also had Camila bring in a civil investigator, someone who could dig into the veterans charity Wyatt had used to funnel money. Within a week, we had bank records, offshore accounts, a dummy corporation registered in Wyoming under a pseudonym connected to his assistant. They'd stolen money in my name, money meant for real veterans, for people who came back in pieces, who couldn't sleep through the night, who couldn't walk without a brace. They used me to defraud those people. That was the moment my anger crystallized into something sharper. This wasn't just personal anymore. This was criminal. Mom didn't return my calls. I only tried once, just to give her the chance. I left a voicemail that said, "You can still step away from this. All you have to do is tell the truth." She never responded. I stopped waiting. Evan, meanwhile, stayed mostly silent. He sent text updates, short and factual. He never called. He never asked how I was holding up. But every now and then, I'd find a bag of groceries on the porch or a note slipped under the door. They won't win. It wasn't much, but it mattered. The day before our next court date, Camila and I sat in her office for hours organizing the presentation. We had a plan, tight, methodical, ruthless in its precision. She laid out the strategy, open with certified service records, followed by video statements from witnesses. Then pivot to the forgery evidence with expert testimony from Ritter. Finally, the emails slowly, one by one, each one more damning than the last. A timeline of conspiracy, greed, and betrayal, layered on top of fake narratives and stolen valor. She paused, pen in hand. "And the folder," I nodded. "I'll deliver it myself." She studied me for a long moment. "You know, once we present this, it doesn't go back in the box. Good. People you love might never speak to you again." I didn't flinch. If they loved me, they wouldn't have done this in the first place. That night, I walked through the Windbluff house with a calm I hadn't felt in months. I paused in front of the old hall mirror, the one with a crack running through the top corner. I studied my reflection, gray flecks in my hair, now a scar peeking from beneath my collar. The faint lines around my eyes earned in deserts and mountains, not boardrooms and brunches. I wasn't the same woman who left this house at 18, and I didn't need to be. I was someone new now, someone rebuilt. The folder sat on the dining table, clean, slim, quiet. It didn't need to shout. Because the truth, when laid bare, doesn't need to scream. It just needs to be seen. And tomorrow they would see it. Courtrooms are nothing like what you see on TV. They're colder, quieter, less dramatic, more surgical. The tension doesn't erupt. It hums low and constant, like a wire strung too tight waiting to snap. And on the morning of our next hearing, I walked into that room, knowing the wire was already fraying. Wyatt was already seated when I arrived, flanked by his attorney and our mother. He wore a gray tailored suit, not the off-the-rack kind. This was the kind that said money control credibility. He didn't look at me, but he didn't need to. The smirk on his face did the talking. Mom sat rigid beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. Not cold, not concerned, just vacant. Like she'd emptied herself to avoid feeling anything that might interfere with the story they'd built. I took my seat next to Camilla, who was already organizing our files into clean, deliberate stacks. She didn't say much. Neither did I. Across the aisle, Evan sat in the gallery, third row, neutral clothes, neutral expression. But his eyes found mine for just a second and didn't look away. The judge entered, called us to order, and the proceedings began. Wyatt's lawyer, a sleek man with sharp vowels and a sharper haircut, launched into his opening like a salesman at a board meeting. He referenced timelines, voiced concerns about inconsistencies in my deployment records. He questioned the sudden reappearance of a sister who had been estranged from the family for over a decade. He made it all sound so reasonable. Then he went further. "Your Honor, the plaintiffs contend that Ms. Rowen's alleged military service lacks verifiable structure, that she may have fabricated elements of her record to influence Mr. Franklin Rowen's final estate decisions." And that alleged Camilla interrupted, her voice calm but firm. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Counselor." She gestured politely. "Will respond in full, Your Honor. But I'd like the court to note the use of the word alleged when referencing federal military documentation." The judge nodded, then turned back to Wyatt's attorney. "Proceed." He smiled like a man who thought he'd already won. "Of course. We don't seek to undermine the U.S. military, only to establish that Ms. Rowen's claims should be examined under the same scrutiny as any estate influence might be. I clenched my jaw. Camila scribbled something on a yellow legal pad and slid it to me. They're going all in on discrediting you. Get ready. I didn't need the warning. I'd been ready for weeks. Then Wyatt stood. No warning, no prep from his counsel. He just stood and said, "I'd like to speak." His lawyer flinched. The judge hesitated. "Mr. Rowen, we haven't. I just need a minute." The judge considered, then nodded. "You may." Wyatt stepped forward like he was giving a toast. He placed one hand on the rail of the witness stand, not to testify, just to lean. "My sister," he began, "has always been complicated." I almost laughed. That word complicated the family's favorite blade. Not cruel, not unstable, just off enough to ignore. She disappeared for years, no contact, no visits, and then she reappears at our father's funeral. And suddenly she's the heir to the house that's been in our family for generations. He turned toward the judge, the corners of his mouth pulled tight in a careful frown. "I don't say this out of malice. I say it out of concern. Because while I respect military service my father served, after all I have seen no convincing evidence that my sister actually did." The room went still. And then he said it. "She's not a veteran. She's a fraud." I didn't blink. I didn't shift in my seat. But something inside me locked into place. Wyatt stood there like he'd delivered the killing blow. Like he'd finally said the thing no one else had the courage to say. The judge looked at Camila. "Counselor, do you intend to respond to that statement now?" Camila stood slowly. "Not yet, Your Honor." "Why not?" She turned to me. "Because my client would like to respond herself." That was the plan. Not a burst of anger, not a dramatic speech, just the truth. I stood, lifted the tan folder from the table, and walked forward. Every step was steady. Every breath was controlled. The clerk opened the half door for me, and I stepped through, approaching the bench. I said nothing. I didn't need to. I placed the folder on the judge's desk, met his eyes for just a moment, and stepped back. He opened the folder. He read the first page. And then he stopped. A silence swept through the courtroom like a slow-moving wave. The judge's hand rose slightly. "Close the doors. No one enters, no one leaves." Behind me, I heard the shuffle of boots. 2 officers from the military police stepped in from the hallway, quiet, unblinking. Wyatt's attorney dropped his pen. My mother stiffened in her seat. And Evan, he closed his eyes. The judge looked up. His voice was colder than the sea air outside. "This court is now in possession of evidence indicating potential fraud, forgery, and misrepresentation of federal military records by the plaintiffs." Wyatt opened his mouth. Nothing came out. And me, I didn't look at anyone. I just returned to my seat. Because I hadn't come to defend my name. I'd come to bury their lie. The silence in the courtroom wasn't empty. It pressed in thick and stifling as the judge passed the folder to his clerk and instructed the military police to stand by. No arrests, not yet, just presence. Authority in a uniform they couldn't manipulate. Wyatt looked like a man who'd forgotten how to breathe. His lawyer leaned in, whispering frantically into his ear, but Wyatt didn't blink. His face had gone pale, jaw-clenched, nostrils flaring slightly like he was trying to hold something in rage. Fear, denial, maybe all of it. I kept my eyes forward. Camila didn't speak. She didn't need to. The judge cleared his throat and addressed the room with quiet gravity. "Due to the emergence of new evidence, this court will recess until further analysis is completed. All parties are ordered not to leave the county." Behind me, a low gasp broke the stillness. My mother. She hadn't said a word all morning, not when Wyatt spoke, not even when the folder was opened. But now I heard it, a small involuntary noise, like something inside her had cracked. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Not yet. As the judge exited and the bailiff started ushering observers out, I felt Camila's hand brush my sleeve. A quiet signal. We stood together and walked out without a word. The hallway was chaos. Reporters blocked the exit, their questions a blur. "Ms. Rowen, did you fabricate documents? Is it true your brother funneled money through a fake charity? Were you actually deployed?" Camila moved like a shield beside me, guiding me through the noise and down the courthouse steps. Outside, the air was sharp with ocean wind. I inhaled, steadying myself, grounding back into my body. They were scrambling now. The press, the lawyers, my brother. and I hadn't even said a single word on record. Back at the house that night, I poured a glass of water and sat on the porch in the dark. No lights, no sound but the ocean crashing below. I'd fought battles in sandstorms, ordered airstrikes with minutes to spare, but this silence felt more dangerous than any of that. Because it was the silence before someone breaks, and I knew who it would be. Just before midnight, I got the text. Evan, he wants to meet. Says he has an explanation. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I replied, me, let him talk. But not to me. The next morning, court resumed. There was a buzz in the air, subdued but electric. The room filled faster than usual, people whispering behind folders, pretending not to stare at me. Wyatt's chair was empty for almost 10 minutes after the scheduled start. When he did arrive, he looked older. His tie was crooked. His collar was wrinkled. For the first time in my life, he looked like a man who no longer trusted his own reflection. The judge entered. No small talk, no pleasantries. He motioned to Camilla. Defense may proceed. She rose, her voice calm. Your Honor, at this time, the defense would like to call Evan Rowen to the stand. Wyatt stiffened. My mother turned toward Evan, lips slightly parted as if to stop him. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at Wyatt. He walked to the witness stand slowly, hands trembling just enough to notice. The clerk swore him in. He took his seat. And then he looked at me, not with apology, with resolve. Camilla approached. Mr. Rowen, can you tell us when you became aware of efforts to discredit your sister's military service? He took a breath. About 2 months before our father died. And what did you find? Emails. Between Wyatt and our mother, they talked about removing Celeste from the will, about altering documents, making sure there was plausible doubt about her service record. The courtroom stilled. Camilla moved carefully. Did you share those emails? Yes. With Celeste. And with your office. And to your knowledge, were any of the documents submitted by the plaintiffs altered or forged? Yes. She nodded. Thank you, Mr. Rowen. No further questions. The judge looked to Wyatt's attorney. Cross-examination. He hesitated, then shook his head. No questions, Your Honor. Wyatt didn't even meet his brother's eyes. As Evan stepped down, he passed within a foot of our mother. She reached for his arm, but he brushed past without pause. When he returned to his seat, he looked forward. But I saw it in his face. He had chosen. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was standing alone. The final morning felt like the calm before a storm. I arrived early, the folder tucked tightly under my arm. Not the thick binder of evidence we'd already submitted, the one Camilla built with methodical precision. This was something else, something smaller, more lethal. Inside it, the original emails Evan recovered, metadata verified by Ritter, signed statements from my former COs, a financial trail connecting Wyatt's charity to offshore accounts, and at the top, a letter from the Department of Defense confirming my full record, deployments, commendations, and combat injury. It wasn't a rebuttal. It was a reckoning. I stepped into the courtroom and I could feel the difference. The usual undercurrent of doubt had shifted. There were whispers, yes, but they weren't aimed at me anymore. Camilla didn't speak as I sat down. She just gave the smallest nod. We were ready. Wyatt looked like he hadn't slept. His tie was gone, his eyes bloodshot. My mother sat stiffly beside him, arms crossed like she was trying to hold herself together from the inside out. Evan was in the back row again, hands folded, eyes forward. The judge entered, glanced briefly around the room, then nodded. Ms. Rowen, he said, do you wish to respond directly? Camilla rose. Your Honor, with the court's permission, my client would like to present final evidence into the record. He nodded. I stood. My boots echoed too loudly as I approached the bench. I placed the file down, fingers resting on the folder for just a beat longer than needed. Then I stepped back. The judge opened it, and the room changed. His brows lowered. He flipped the first few pages quickly, then slowed. He reached for his reading glasses. Silence fell like a curtain. After a full minute, he spoke, voice low, steady. This court is now in possession of direct evidence indicating material fraud by the plaintiffs, including falsified documents and financial misrepresentation involving federal charities. He looked up. Military police secure the room. No one leaves. The click of boots on marble answered him before the words finished echoing. Wyatt's attorney dropped his pen. My mother didn't move. I didn't look at anyone. I just returned to my seat. Breath steady, hands calm. The judge turned back to Camilla. Pending review, this civil case is hereby suspended. Immediate referral for criminal investigation is authorized. He paused. Ms. Rowen, the court thanks you for your service. And that was it. No gavel, no applause. Just the sound of walls finally collapsing under the weight of truth. They say the truth sets you free. But first it wrecks everything in its path. The courthouse emptied in near silence. Reporters waited just beyond the steps, but no one rushed out. Not Wyatt, not my mother, certainly not me. Inside, the air felt thinner, not lighter, just less. Like something poisonous had finally been exhaled from the room. The judge left with a brief nod. The court clerk gathered the evidence under military supervision. Camilla began packing our case files. Her movements slow, deliberate. I remained seated, hands still resting flat on the table. Wyatt didn't speak. His lawyer leaned toward him, whispering in a rush, but Wyatt didn't react. He sat like stone, eyes glazed, lips tight. The man who had strutted into court weeks earlier with full confidence and tailored suits now looked like someone whose armor had been peeled off piece by piece until only the truth remained. My mother stayed beside him, stiff and wordless, but I saw it in her. The way her eyes darted toward the door, the way her hands trembled slightly against the leather strap of her purse. She wasn't worried about losing a case. She was afraid of being seen, of having her carefully constructed image cracked wide open in front of strangers, neighbors, a courtroom full of people she couldn't control. As the military police escorted the file to their vehicle, I stood. That's when Evan moved. He stepped forward, not toward Wyatt, not toward our mother, but toward me. For a second I thought he might say something, an apology maybe, a thank you, but he didn't. He just stopped a few feet away, hands deep in his jacket pockets, his gaze soft but steady. I should have done it sooner, he said, voice low. I shook my head gently. You did it when it counted. He swallowed hard and nodded. Behind him, Wyatt finally shifted in his seat, turning just slightly. His eyes locked onto mine. Gone was the contempt, the superiority. In its place, something far simpler and far more hollow. Defeat. But not the kind that teaches, the kind that scorches. I didn't say a word to him. I'd already said everything I needed to. Outside, the wind off the Pacific met me like an old friend. Cold, bracing, but honest. I stood at the top of the courthouse steps and looked out, not at the press, not at the questions waiting to be shouted, but at the sky. Blue, wide, unbothered. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I owed anyone an explanation. Not the town, not the family, not even the judge. Because the fight was never about proving I was a soldier. It was about refusing to be erased. I came back to the Windbluff house that evening just before sunset. The sky had softened into that familiar Northern California gold, streaked with lavender clouds, and the scent of salt and pine drifted through the open windows like a memory too heavy to forget. The porch creaked under my boots as I stepped up. No fanfare, no applause, just quiet, just the sound of waves chewing at the base of the cliffs far below. I unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and paused in the entryway. The house smelled the same old wood, lemon oil, a trace of my father's pipe tobacco that somehow lingered in the baseboards, even after all these years. I walked through each room slowly. The den, the kitchen, the hall with the cracked mirror. I let my hand drift over the wainscoting, the worn frame of the stair rail, the etched initials still half visible on the bathroom door. CR, I had fought for this place. But more than that, I had fought to not be written out of it. I left the courtroom with nothing in my hands, but everything in my name. Wyatt and my mother would face the legal consequences in time. The judge had referred their actions to the appropriate authorities. Fraud, forgery, misappropriation of charitable funds. Words that once lived on paper now carried real weight. But I wasn't thinking about them anymore. I was thinking about the garden. I stepped out the back door and down into the overgrown rows, where my father once grew tomatoes and thyme and little bursts of cherry peppers that made your mouth burn and your eyes water. I knelt down, pressed my fingers into the soil. It was still good, still alive. Behind me, I heard footsteps on gravel. I didn't turn. Evan's voice was quiet. "You're really staying," I nodded. Yeah, I am. He came to stand beside me, hands in his pockets, the way he always did when he didn't know what to say. I don't think they'll ever speak to me again, he said. They might not. I'm not sure I want them to. We stood like that for a long time. No more to be said. No forgiveness asked. No forgiveness demanded. Just shared space. Shared blood. Eventually, he said, "Let me know if you need help fixing the roof." I smiled at that. Small, honest. You know where to find me. He nodded, then walked back up the hill, leaving me there in the garden, kneeling in the dirt, the sky turning indigo overhead. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel whole. But I felt something sturdier than both. I felt rooted. The house remained. And so did I. In the weeks that followed, the world moved on. The case made local news for a while, clickbait headlines, and 30-second coverage on the evening broadcast. Some neighbors sent polite messages. Others said nothing. A few still crossed the street to avoid making eye contact. I didn't blame them. People don't like being reminded that the line between family and betrayal can be paper thin. But inside this house, my house, things changed in quieter ways. I rebuilt the garden, trimmed back the brambles, planted late summer vegetables, laid new mulch along the path my father used to pace when talking to himself about irrigation lines and pruning schedules. I mended the broken fence along the cliff's edge, started repainting the eaves, one task at a time, one piece of control reclaimed. Evan came by sometimes. He never stayed long. He didn't have to. We sat in silence, watched the sun fall into the sea, said little, but there was something honest in that silence. Something I could hold without fear it would vanish again. Wyatt and my mother stopped contacting either of us. The investigation was ongoing. There would be consequences eventually, but I had stopped checking the headlines. I had already done what mattered. Because in the end, this wasn't about a court case or a house or even a legacy. It was about not disappearing. It was about saying I was here, I existed, I mattered. There's a strange kind of peace in that. Not the kind that comes from forgiveness or reconciliation, but the kind that comes from choosing yourself even when no one else does. I'm not the daughter they wanted. I never was. But I'm not a fraud. I'm not a ghost. I'm a soldier who came home, not for applause, not for acceptance, but to stand my ground. And I did. So if you're listening to this, if someone has tried to write you out of your own story, don't let them. Sometimes the quietest form of justice isn't revenge. It's survival. It's truth. It's still being here when they expected you to vanish. And sometimes that's enough.